On the morning of June 15, 2015, a Facebook post appeared on a woman's page. It had been sent from her own account. It read, "That bitch is dead." The neighbors in Springfield, Missouri had seen the lights off for a couple of days. The curtains were drawn. Nothing unusual, Dee Dee Blanchard kept to herself. What was unusual was the little pink house going quiet. Because Dee Dee's daughter, Gypsy Rose, was always there. Always visible. Always sick. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was 23 years old. She had lived her entire life in a wheelchair. She had survived leukemia twice. She had the mind, doctors had been told, of a 7-year-old. She wore a feeding tube. She had lost most of her teeth. She had never spent a single night outside her mother's home. Or so the world believed. When police made a welfare check at the small pink house on West Volunteer Way, they found Claudine Dee Dee Blanchard in her bedroom. Stabbed. Multiple times. She had been dead for several days. But Gypsy Rose was nowhere. And suddenly, investigators were faced with a question that unraveled everything they thought they knew about a little girl in a wheelchair. What if she had never been sick at all? What came next would expose one of the most disturbing cases of medical child abuse in modern American history, a story of deception, captivity, and a daughter who finally decided she wanted to live. Her mother kept her sick her entire childhood. What she did next shocked the world. Welcome back to Dark Case Files, where we go beyond the headlines to understand the full, complicated human story underneath. Before we begin, a content note. Today's case involves prolonged medical child abuse, psychological manipulation, and violence. We'll handle this story with care, and will be mindful of the fact that the central figure here is both a victim and a convicted felon. That complexity is exactly why this case matters. Now, to understand what happened inside that little pink house, you need to first understand who Gypsy Rose Blanchard actually was. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was born on July 27, 1991, in Golden Meadow, Louisiana, to Claudine Blanchard, known to everyone as Dee Dee, and Rod Blanchard, who separated from Dee Dee shortly after Gypsy's birth. Gypsy was, by all accounts, a bright-eyed, social child. She loved Disney princesses. She loved makeup tutorials. She loved music and dancing. She had a warm, bubbly laugh that people who knew her, the real her, remembered clearly. But for virtually her entire childhood, Gypsy Rose lived a different story. The story her mother told. And the town of Springfield, Missouri, where the Blanchards eventually settled after Hurricane Katrina displaced them from Louisiana in 2005, had no reason to question it. Springfield is a mid-sized city in the Ozarks. Tight-knit. Church-going. The kind of place where neighbors brought casseroles. Where communities rallied around families in need. And that is exactly the kind of town Dee Dee Blanchard chose, and needed. Because for everything Dee Dee gave Gypsy, she was also taking something far greater away. What Gypsy Rose endured over more than 2 decades would later be classified as one of the most sustained cases of factitious disorder imposed on another, commonly known as Munchausen by proxy, ever documented in the American medical system. On the night of June 14, 2015, Gypsy Rose Blanchard was finally, horrifically free. This is how it happened. To understand what Dee Dee Blanchard built, you have to understand how carefully she built it. From the moment Gypsy Rose was an infant, Dee Dee began telling doctors that something was wrong with her daughter. Gypsy was allegedly born with chromosomal defects. Then sleep apnea. Then she couldn't keep food down. Then her muscle development was off. By the time Gypsy was a toddler, Dee Dee had her in a succession of specialists. Each one heard what Dee Dee told them and treated accordingly. Because no one, not one physician, thought to look at the mother. Gypsy's medical records, later reviewed by investigators, would catalog a staggering list of alleged conditions: leukemia, muscular dystrophy, epilepsy, vision impairment, severe cognitive delays, chromosomal defects, asthma. She underwent surgeries. She was given medications, including powerful sedatives, that she had no documented medical need for. She was fed through a tube. She had her salivary glands removed. And most visibly, she used a wheelchair. A wheelchair she did not need. Rod Blanchard, Gypsy's biological father, would later tell investigators and journalists that he had concerns that Gypsy had seemed healthier to him than Dee Dee ever let on. But Dee Dee controlled access. She controlled the narrative. And she controlled Gypsy. Gypsy was not enrolled in public school. She was homeschooled, exclusively by Dee Dee. Her social contact was minimal and heavily supervised. When she was allowed online, Dee Dee monitored every message. Gypsy's identity was constructed entirely by her mother. She was told she was younger than she was. For years, Gypsy believed she had been born in 1995, not 1991. That is how completely Dee Dee had rewritten reality for her own daughter. And yet, the world was watching and clapping. In 2005, after Hurricane Katrina devastated the Gulf Coast, the Blanchards lost their home in Louisiana. They relocated temporarily, then eventually settled in Springfield, Missouri, with significant help from Habitat for Humanity, which built them a specially modified pink home, wheelchair ramps included, for free. The Make-A-Wish Foundation granted Gypsy wishes multiple times. She met Miranda Lambert. She attended Disney World. She was photographed in princess gowns, smiling. St. Louis Children's Hospital, Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital, and dozens of other institutions treated her. Nobody connected the dots. Dee Dee was described by neighbors and charity workers alike as a devoted, selfless, heroic mother. She appeared on local news segments. She accepted donations. She built a life, a financially and socially rewarding life, entirely around her daughter's manufactured illness. And through all of it, Gypsy Rose was watching. She later told investigators, and publicly, in documentary interviews, that she had known, at some level, for years. She knew she could walk. She knew she could chew food. She knew she was older than her mother claimed. But she also knew what happened when she didn't comply. Dee Dee was not only manipulative, she was controlling in ways that crossed into imprisonment. Gypsy's teeth were pulled. Her hair was shaved when she tried to grow it out against Dee Dee's wishes. She was given medications that made her lethargic, confused, dependent. When she tried to run, once, with an online boyfriend she briefly connected with, Dee Dee tracked her down, humiliated her publicly, smashed her computer, and chained her to the bed. That was the world Gypsy Rose Blanchard had lived in for more than 2 decades. By 2015, she was 23 years old. She had discovered a way to get back online. She had created a secret Facebook account. And she had found someone. His name was Nicholas Godejohn. And he would become the most dangerous decision Gypsy Rose ever made. Or the only exit she believed she had left. It was Sunday, June 14, 2015. At some point that night, Nicholas Godejohn, who had traveled from Big Bend, Wisconsin to Springfield, entered the Blanchard home. Gypsy Rose later told investigators she hid in the bathroom. She did not watch, but she heard. Dee Dee Blanchard, 48 years old, was stabbed multiple times in her bed. She likely died quickly. The medical examiner would later confirm. Her death was caused by multiple stab wounds to the back. Godejohn and Gypsy fled to Wisconsin the same night. For several days, no one came looking. The neighbors were used to the curtains being closed. They were used to Dee Dee managing access to Gypsy. They had no reason to knock. Until the Facebook post. On June 15, 2015, a message posted to Dee Dee Blanchard's public Facebook account read, "That bitch is dead." Followed, shortly after, by a second post, far more graphic, that many of Dee Dee's Facebook friends initially assumed was a hack, a prank, or some kind of terrible mistake. One of those friends, a woman named Kim Blanchard, who had known the family for years, did not assume it was a prank. She called the Greene County Sheriff's Department. Officers arrived at the pink house on West Volunteer Way. The front door was unlocked. The lights were off. There was no sign of Gypsy Rose. In the back bedroom, they found Dee Dee. She had been dead for approximately 2 days. Detective Brian Waddle of the Greene County Sheriff's Department was among the first investigators on the scene. He later described the case, in court documents and press accounts, as unlike anything he had worked before. Not because of the crime scene itself, but because of what the investigation revealed. Initially, there was alarm for Gypsy Rose. She was a disabled woman, a vulnerable adult. Someone had killed her mother. Where was she? An Amber Alert was considered. A missing persons investigation was opened. But as investigators began pulling records, medical records, financial records, court documents, the picture began to fracture. Gypsy's medical files were voluminous. Hundreds of appointments. Dozens of hospitals. But experienced forensic investigators and medical consultants who reviewed them began flagging something that should have been flagged years earlier. The diagnoses didn't track. The symptoms reported by the mother didn't align with findings documented by physicians in their own notes. Several doctors had written, in buried lines of clinical notation, that they had been unable to independently verify certain reported symptoms, that they had relied heavily on the mother's account. And here was the most chilling detail. Gypsy Rose had a medical record documenting chromosomal abnormalities that a simple blood test could have disproven at any time. Nobody ordered that test, because nobody suspected the mother. Mid-segment RE hook. But here is where the investigation took its sharpest turn. Law enforcement pulled the IP address behind that Facebook post. It traced back not to Springfield, Missouri, but to Big Bend, Wisconsin. Within 24 hours of the discovery, Greene County detectives were in contact with Washington County authorities in Wisconsin. On June 17, 2015, just 2 days after the Facebook post, Nicholas Godejohn, 23, was taken into custody. And with him, Gypsy Rose Blanchard. Walking on her own 2 feet. The woman the world had believed was wheelchair-bound. Cognitively impaired, chronically and terminally ill. Walked out of that house in Wisconsin unassisted. Investigators who had spent 2 days searching for a vulnerable missing woman were now looking at something else entirely. They were looking at a murder suspect who had spent her entire life as a prisoner. By June 20, 2015, both Gypsy Rose Blanchard and Nicholas Godejohn had been charged in connection with Dee Dee's murder. Godejohn was charged with first-degree murder. Gypsy Rose was charged with second-degree murder. And immediately, the internet and the public fractured, because the story investigators began piecing together in the weeks and months after the arrest was not a clean story. It was not a story of a cold-blooded killer. It was the story of a young woman who had been, in the words of her own defense attorneys, a victim before she was a defendant. Let's look at what investigators established about Dee Dee Blanchard. Dee Dee was born Claudine Petra in 1967 in Louisiana. Family members later told reporters and documentary filmmakers that there had always been something concerning about Dee Dee, particularly around illness. Her own mother had reportedly died under suspicious circumstances. There were suggestions that Dee Dee herself had a long history of fabricating or inducing illness in herself and in others. Munchausen by proxy, clinically, factitious disorder imposed on another, is a form of abuse in which a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in a dependent, typically a child, to gain attention, sympathy, and control. It is considered one of the most difficult forms of abuse to detect, because the perpetrator is often perceived as a devoted, loving caregiver. Dee Dee was the textbook. She coached Gypsy on what to say to doctors. She threatened and punished Gypsy when she disclosed the truth. She isolated her from every potential support system. She altered medical records. She moved across state lines, partly, prosecutors would argue, to stay ahead of any institution that might grow suspicious. Gypsy had met Nicholas Godejohn in 2012 on a Christian dating website, one she had secretly accessed after creating a profile behind Dee Dee's back. Their relationship, conducted almost entirely online, was deeply unusual. Godejohn had been diagnosed with autism and had a documented history of behavioral and legal issues. The relationship involved role-playing and fantasy. And, critically, Gypsy later stated that she had asked Godejohn to help her get away from her mother. That request, prosecutors argued, became a plan. And that plan ended in Dee Dee Blanchard's death. At trial, and in recorded police interviews later made public, there were two competing versions of events. Godejohn's version, that he had acted on Gypsy's direction, that she had orchestrated the killing, that he was, in his framing, also manipulated. Gypsy's version, that she had not intended for her mother to die, that she had wanted to escape, not to kill, that she had hidden in the bathroom because she couldn't bear to see it. Here's what we know for certain from the documented record. The knife was brought to the house by Godejohn. Gypsy let him in. Gypsy stayed in the bathroom during the attack. Gypsy had texted Godejohn explicit instructions about the plan in the days prior. Those texts, retrieved from phone records, were presented in full during proceedings. They are deeply disturbing. And they complicated the simple narrative of Gypsy as pure victim. But here is the revelation that shifted public opinion most dramatically. When Gypsy was medically evaluated after her arrest, independently, by physicians with no connection to Dee Dee, they found no evidence of muscular dystrophy, no evidence of leukemia, past or present, no chromosomal abnormalities, normal vision, normal cognitive function. She tested with an average IQ, and legs that were fully functional. She was, physically, a healthy 23-year-old woman. Everything Dee Dee had spent 2 decades telling the world, telling doctors, hospitals, charities, journalists, neighbors, was a fabrication. The medical community's response was, in many quarters, one of institutional shame. Dr. Mark Feldman, a leading expert on Munchausen by proxy, stated publicly that the Blanchard case represented a catastrophic failure of the medical system to protect a child patient. Gypsy Rose had been seen by over 150 medical appointments across multiple hospitals and states, and no one had caught it. Rod Blanchard, Gypsy's father, who had been kept at the margins of his daughter's life by Dee Dee's manipulation, spoke publicly about learning the truth. He described it as grieving twice. Once for the childhood his daughter should have had, and once for the years he had been kept away from her by a woman he now understood to be profoundly dangerous. Gypsy's stepmother, Christy Blanchard, would become one of Gypsy's most consistent advocates as the case moved through the courts. For the investigators, the prosecutors, and for the public watching, the question was no longer whether Dee Dee had abused Gypsy. That was undeniable. The question was, what did justice look like for a girl who had been a prisoner her entire life, and who had finally, violently, broken free? Nicholas Godejohn and Gypsy Rose Blanchard were tried separately. Godejohn's trial came first, in November 2018. He elected to represent himself for portions of the proceedings, a decision that legal observers noted worked significantly against him. He argued that he had been manipulated by Gypsy, that he had acted out of love, that he had not understood the full reality of what he was doing. The jury did not find that persuasive. On November 15, 2018, Nicholas Godejohn was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gypsy Rose Blanchard entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder in July 2015, before Godejohn's trial. Her defense had negotiated. The prosecution, faced with the overwhelming evidence of Dee Dee's abuse, and deeply aware of the public complexity of the case, agreed to the plea. On July 5, 2016, Gypsy Rose Blanchard was sentenced to 10 years in the Missouri Department of Corrections. She would serve her time at the Chillicothe Correctional Center. by nearly all accounts from prison staff and fellow inmates. She was a model prisoner. She obtained her GED behind bars. She became a peer counselor. She got married to Ryan Anderson, a Louisiana man who had written to her. After following the case, in a prison ceremony in 2022, on December 28, 2023, Gypsy Rose Blanchard was released on parole. Having served approximately 8 years of her 10-year sentence, her release was national news. She stepped out of Chillicothe to a waiting crowd of cameras. She was 32 years old. She had never lived a single day of adult life outside of captivity. First her mother's, then the state's. She was free. Her father, Rod Blanchard, was there to receive her. In subsequent interviews, on television and in her own memoir, Gypsy Rose described the first time she ate what she wanted, slept without a schedule imposed on her, made a choice for herself. She described simple things: picking out her own clothes, staying up late, cooking scrambled eggs, things the rest of us have never had to think about. The case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard prompted widespread conversation about the failures of the medical and social services systems to identify and intervene in cases of medical child abuse. Dr. Randall Alexander, a specialist in child abuse pediatrics, testified and spoke publicly about how perpetrators like Dee Dee exploit the professional trust that medical institutions extend to parents. In 2019, Hulu released The Act, a dramatic series starring Patricia Arquette and Joey King, which brought the case to an even wider audience. Dee Dee Blanchard was never charged with any crime. She died before any investigation into her abuse could be formally opened. What accountability exists belongs to a system that let it continue for more than 2 decades. Gypsy Rose Blanchard is, at the time of this video, 32 years old. She is living in Louisiana, navigating a public life she never asked for, and a private life she is only beginning to build. She loves doing her own makeup. She loves deciding what to eat. She is learning, piece by piece, what it means to exist as herself. Whatever you think of the choices Gypsy Rose made, and this is a case where reasonable people genuinely disagree, it is impossible to look at her childhood without recognizing it for what it was. She was not a patient. She was a hostage. And the system, medical, social, educational, charitable, handed Dee Dee Blanchard the keys, year after year, and called her a hero for it. Cases like Gypsy Rose's are not as rare as we want to believe. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the Child Welfare Information Gateway, and medical advocates have noted that factitious disorder imposed on another remains one of the most underreported and underidentified forms of child abuse, precisely because its perpetrators were the face of devoted care. If you are a healthcare worker, a teacher, a neighbor, the lesson of this case is not to be suspicious of every parent. It is to listen to the child. Always. Listen to the child. Thank you for spending this hour with me. These stories are never easy, and I don't take the weight of them lightly. If this video made you think, if it made you feel, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps this channel continue doing work like this. Drop a comment below. I want to know what aspect of this case sits with you the most. The medical failures, Gypsy's choices, the verdict. There are no wrong answers. I read every single one. And if you know a case that deserves this kind of attention, leave it in the comments. You never know which story becomes the one that finally gets told. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, the most dangerous cages are the ones nobody can see.